Hi, folks. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for tuning in on this very chilly Montana evening following the general election that we had yesterday. My name is John Benyon. I'm with the Washington Companies for my day job, but I have the privilege of serving on the board of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center, which is an academic unit of the University of Montana in Missoula. So the Mansfield Center has two core missions. The first is to foster a civil discourse in our politics, in our democracy, much like Mike Mansfield did during his time in public service. And the second is to focus on U.S.-Asia relations, building links across the Pacific Ocean with those important countries, much like Mike Mansfield did as an ambassador. So we here at the Mansfield Center try to provide content that is interesting, timely, relevant, thoughtful, that starts a dialogue, starts a conversation. And so that's why I'm super excited to be moderating this dialogue here tonight with two legislators that I greatly respect. And that's the topic tonight is civility in the Montana Legislature. What does that look like? What should it look like? And with that, I'm going to introduce our two legislators. I'm going to start with Republican legislator Lou Jones, who is out of Conrad. Lou is a farmer, a rancher, a businessman. His service in the legislature goes back to 2005, and he's served in both chambers. And he has a particular expertise in the appropriations process. And so he understands quite a bit about the state budget. Our second presenter is Democratic legislator Kim Abbott out of Helena. Kim is a consultant who has worked on a variety of social justice and economic justice causes in her professional career. She's been in the legislature since 2017, and in the last session, she actually served as the Democratic House Minority Leader. And from everything that I know, she may continue to serve in that capacity, but we'll know next week. So welcome to Representative Abbott and Representative Jones.
Thanks, John.
Thank you. Thank you both for taking some time to join us. You were probably both up late last night, so you might be a little bit drowsy. But what I've done is I prepared some questions that relate to the topic, not only of the elections, the legislature, but what we're here to talk about tonight, which is civility. And we also had some pre-prepared questions that were submitted to us from the audience as well. And so what I've tried to do is weave those into our discussion tonight. But for our first question, let's just talk about what happened yesterday. We had some big races at the national level. We had control of the U.S. Senate, the U.S. House up for grabs. And as far as I know, they're still kind of both up for grabs. We don't know. And then here in Montana, we had, of course, 100 House seats on the ballot. We had around 26 Senate seats on the ballot. We had Public Service Commission seats, 2 congressional seats, the Western District getting a lot of attention, and some state Supreme Court seats that received a lot of attention as well. So what I want to do is give you both a couple of minutes just to talk about your reaction to the elections. What do you think that they mean? We know that we're waiting on a lot of results. So let's start with Representative Abbott. What did you think about yesterday?
I thought there were some really interesting results. The biggest one, I think, was LR 131 going down the way that it did. It was an anti-abortion measure that was referred to the ballot by the legislature and was really meant to be divisive, I think. That was my opinion on it. And I don't think a lot of people thought it had a chance of going down. And I think what we saw was Montanans sort of standing up and saying, like, our right to privacy is very important to us. I think we saw that play out in the Gustafson Supreme Court race as well. And, in terms of legislative races, I think that you've heard Democrats say a lot that like these districts that we're running in haven't been durable. They're old and they're broken. And, Democrats are about 44% of the two-party vote share. And it seems like the ceiling in the House is about 33. And, that's not fair representation for Democrats. And so I think we saw that play out. And we're excited to get engaged in the redistricting process here in a couple weeks.
Great. You didn't talk about it specifically, but we were talking about it a little bit beforehand, the makeup of the legislature, what it's going to look like. And it looks like maybe Republicans have picked up around 3 seats in the state Senate, which would put them around 34 seats, and maybe kind of in the range of 67 to 69 seats in the House. Is that kind of how you see it?
Yeah, I think our caucus in the House, I think you're right in the Senate. And I think in the House, we have a couple really close ones. We lost a heartbreaker in Deer Lodge, it looks like, but there's still provisional ballots out there. And then up in 15 in Browning, Representative Weatherwax is down 10 and there's some rejected ballots. So I think we won't know for a little bit, just like the national scene, exactly where we land. But I think 32 is about right in the House.
Sure. Well, let's shift over to you, Lou. When you looked at all the races, whether it's national or here in the state, kind of what was your takeaway of what happened yesterday?
Well, national, it looks like that likely the Republicans will control the House on the national level. That seems to be where that's headed, but probably not by nearly as much given inflation as some folks thought. The Senate's still a toss-up, although it appears there's a pathway for control of the Senate. But the margins, if it arrives there, will be much smaller than anticipated early on in the discussions. State-wise, I would, Kim made some statements I would agree with. I would think that currently, if I had guessed, I would have felt the House would have stayed around 33. I didn't think they would lose too many in the House, and it might shift around a little. There are some provisionals out. I think Fitzpatrick's probably pretty secure. It's pretty narrow there on that race for John Fitzpatrick's to change down in the Anaconda area. Obviously, House District 15, that's much closer, and with some provisionals, that's a tighter deal up there. The House District 15, and to be honest, there was another race down there in I think it was 41 that I didn't see coming. It seemed like the tribal response this time was different than some years. Some of the turnout and some of the votes off that area were interesting. I guess I was not too surprised of LR 131. I think most of those issues on the ballot create a bunch of mixed emotions, and so that wasn't a surprise to me. I knew it would be close, but I had not thought that was probably the right way to do that sort of an item anyway. But overall, an interesting time frame. I guess I probably had thought maybe Jacobson would hold in Great Falls. He's been a long known name. He's been there for a while. I thought he had some possibilities of retaining that. And that actually was a larger margin than I thought. I'd actually thought Tom might still be there. So that was a bit of a surprise as races went. Other than that, it was probably reasonably aligned with what folks expected to happen.
Thanks for sharing that. So one of the things, if we have time at the very end, that I want to bring up is the discussion about a supermajority. What does that mean? Republicans were kind of salivating at the possibility of that. Democrats, of course, were very fearful of that, which could allow the supermajority to make changes to the Constitution to go on to the ballot for the people to approve. But that's something we can get to at the end. I want to shift gears now to the upcoming session that we have. And I've been around sessions since 2007. And what I know is they all kind of look the same, and then they're all very different. And the one thing that's the same is you're just jamming, of course, hundreds and hundreds of bills on dozens and dozens of different topics. You've got 4 months for out of this 2-year period to really set a budget and govern the state. And that's a lot to do. This next session, people are looking at a budget surplus and they're saying, well, what does that mean? And there were a lot of people in the audience, in the comments, that asked questions around that. And so in my experience, there's about usually 5 to 10 issues that really set every individual session apart from others. And so what I'm kind of curious, and we'll start with you, Representative Jones, is what are the top issues that you really see needing to be addressed or that will be addressed this next session?
Well, it'll begin with the budget surplus, right? First, folks sometimes think that's an ongoing surplus. A significant portion of that is considered OTO. It's linked to some of the ARPA and other emergency dollars that came to the state. And so we don't expect that to continue, but I believe that how that will be disposed of, the pathways will follow, and I tend to be on the pro side, so the columns that will go out will be a topic of debate. What's OTO, what are reserves, what are potentially other uses that it'll follow. It'll have to stay in the OTO column. Housing is an issue, attainable housing. You hear property tax wherever you go. Obviously, you could have some options for some temporary property tax items with the OTO, but what is some long-term items of property tax? Overall tax reforms always come up. Income tax or an income tax credit. I'm sure that'll be around. A major issue will be provider rates. The medical system is struggling in some areas. A lot of times the big hospitals cry wolf pretty loudly, and it's not true, but I can tell you, as been looking at the books now, having 22 to 24% increases in the cost of acquiring nurses, et cetera, and nursing homes closing, provider rates will be big. Mental health, Warm Springs is struggling to do its mission, and how do you deal with our mental health problems? That's big. Public safety will be up. We got big drug problems in Billings and challenges there. A lot of thievery going on and items being marketed on Facebook and such. How do we deal with this? Recruitment and retention of teachers, of workers, that'll be another huge topic. Other areas, I believe there will be, at least on this side of aisle, a lot of discussion that there's a significant feelings of a partisan judiciary that will come up. I believe that will be a significant topic, and I believe there'll be some folks. I tend to stay in the fiscal realm, but I do believe that there'll be some education transparency issues that'll be brought up as well. Those will probably be, in my mind, there'll be a ton of topics, but those will be the hot topics you hear about over and over and over again.
All right, thanks. Well, let's shift over to you, Representative Abbott. What do you see as, some of the top 5 or 10 issues that you guys could be tackling?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Lou that, that budget surplus and how we invest it and where we invest it is going to be top of mind for a lot of folks. I think, our caucus is going to be really focused on, how we build out an economy that works for families and for businesses and for our communities. And I think that you'll see a lot of legislation around housing. We have workforce housing issues in the state. It's affecting businesses, it's affecting families. I think you'll see a lot of legislation and ideas, and sometimes opposing ideas around how we invest in housing. And our perspective on that is that you need to address it through multiple angles. We need to build supply. We need to look at regulations that make it hard to build. We need to subsidize in some ways. It's going to take a menu of options to solve the problem. Childcare is another one directly related to, our businesses being able to hire workforce and keep workforce. We definitely need to pursue solutions on childcare, and I think you'll see legislation on that. Lou's right that financing our healthcare system is just such a big issue. It's a complex issue, and luckily, both sides of the aisle have, I think, a lot of expertise and a lot of goodwill to work together on those issues. And we we disagree sometimes on approach, but I think we've been able to really move important policy that's helped. And I think that I'm hopeful that we can do that again this session. And yeah, mental health and the way that it impacts our communities, the way that it impacts our safety, the way that it impacts our families, and the way that it, impacts the correction system, I think, is something that we need to tackle. And that's an area where I think there are a lot of different approaches, and getting to agreement can be tricky on that. But I know there's a lot of energy, from Republicans and Democrats to tackle that. So I mostly agree. Nothing more to add.
Thanks for sharing. So as a board member of the Mike Mansfield Center, I get to talk about what we do quite a bit. And of course, the civility and politics piece, which we're here to talk about tonight, comes up a lot. And I have to say that when I talk to folks about it, I get a lot of head nods that like we need more of it and people are seeing less of it. And I think a big part of that is oftentimes what they see coming out of DC, that it seems very dysfunctional. It seems like we've kind of lost it when it comes to being able to relate to others and talk to each other. And so what I wanted to know is you both serve in Helena, but you're familiar enough with DC and the stories and all that. Is Helena just a mini DC in your experience? Or is there a little bit of a different thing going on here? And let's start with you, Representative Abbott.
Yeah, I think that increased political polarization has impacted Helena and the Montana Legislature a little bit more recently than it had maybe in the past. I think we're different than DC in a lot of different ways. I think that, Montanans like divided government for a long time. There was a Democratic governor and majorities for Republicans in the House and Senate. And, when I'm on doors, I hear a lot from people that they just wish that the squabbling would stop and that people would work together. And like what I've been able to say to them is like, I've got good news for you. When Bullock was governor and the legislature was Republican, like everything had to be bipartisan in the past, like we had to work together. And so I think we're different than DC in a lot of ways. But I do think the polarization and, increasingly when you're looking, well, look at last night's returns where you have people winning House seats by 75%, the margin there, you don't have to talk to somebody from the other party if you're winning by that kind of margin. And I don't think that's very good for democracy. I don't think it's very good for solutions for our communities. I think I'm glad that I talk to Republicans when I run. I think that I learn. I value relationships like the one I have with Lou. I think it challenges me. It makes me think about things differently. And I think it's been helpful. So, I think the increased polarization and districts that just aren't competitive, people show up and they're just not used to hearing difference. They haven't needed to. And so I'm of the mind that more competitive districts are better for solutions and better for governance.
So Lou, what do you think? Is Helena just a little mini DC? I mean, is it just a subset of what we're seeing at the national level?
Well, my goal has always been to leave DC chaos in DC. I've never felt that hyper-partisan approach made any sense. Of course, my continually pushing that sometimes gets me targeted, not just by from both sides of the aisle. But Montana's more of a small town, right? That's the truth of it. We see familiar faces all over. It's, obviously there's folks that I have more of a similar, often it's an urban-rural divide as much as anything. But there's folks that on both sides of the aisle I talk all the time with. Obviously, the minority leader, Kim Abbott, and I talk quite often. Previous to that, John Cecil out of Butte was one of my best friends, still is. We talk often. I spent a lot of time working with the previous budget director, Director Villa at that time. And so obviously we learned to talk, discuss. You can disagree with folks without being disagreeable. The challenge isn't, it used to always be, seems to get a little narrower at times, that there was kind of a four-party system going on. There were some pretty extreme tales on both sides, but generally the middle talked with itself. Sometimes I'm a little worried that the tails can get a little too big. And if you get too much weight out on, well, I say like an airplane, you got to have the mass in the middle, because if you get too much weight out on a wingtip, you can kind of spin her on in, and that may not be so good for people's outcomes. But yeah, term limits have impacted that some. But so far, Montana has still had a small town feel. We get to know each other fairly well. Yes, it gets a little emotional. Yes, we don't always agree on some of the items, but most of the time I've been able to have a civil conversation with folks. I come from like a 70-30 Republican district, but if you go back home, folks will tell you that I always talk about solutions. I'm rarely a extreme ideologue. It's not my approach to much of anything. Yeah, I just figure you got to solve problems for Montanans. And hopefully there's still a critical mass of folks that think that way.
So let's talk about that a little bit more, because it's an approach that maybe a lot of Montanans think that they don't see a lot of right now. And you've got, by my count, I think there's going to be around 30 people in the legislature that are true freshmen, people that didn't serve in either body before. It's about 20% of the legislature. Now, maybe some people have a little bit of experience from lobbying or coming and testifying on things or whatever. But, these are people that could be brand new. And, they may be people that don't have that kind of a perspective that you just laid out, Representative Jones, and they're more ready for something like CNN Crossfire or whatever. And so, like, how do you, when you're talking to people, freshmen, what have you done in the past, or what do you anticipate doing with freshmen as they're coming in, so that they understand that perspective that, yeah, it's okay to go talk to so-and-so across the aisle, they're not going to bite you.
You tell me or Kim, who do you want?
Sure. Well, let's start with you, and then we'll shift to Representative Abbott.
I make a point. So first off, I'm glad you began with CNN Crossfire, just so I can do, claim I made a partisan jab. But anyway, I'm past that. I try to make a point of calling the majority of the freshmen. We've talked a multitude of times. I make an argument that you inform yourself. And so this is actually, as probably a talented group of freshmen that the vast majority, at least on the R side of the aisle, that I've talked to, that I've came across. They're thoughtful people. They've been successful in their personal lives. They're looking to solve problems. Sometimes they have, because they haven't had the opportunity to see all sides. They don't necessarily see all the perspectives, but most of the time they're willing to listen, and most of those folks are there trying to solve something, right? I always tell them the same things, which is always do what you say you're going to do when you say you're going to do it. Same thing I tell business folks. If you keep your word, do what you say you're going to do when you say you're going to do it, it'll help. And be transparent. Tell folks what you're working on. They may disagree with you. That's fine, but at least you're not lying to them. You're not surprising them. And for the most part, we get there. It is difficult with that turnover. You think of a job setting with that turnover, it's huge. And of course, people that are running for election can be a little prom kingish and a prom queenish. They're used to being able to kind of get everything their way. It takes a while to learn to play nice with each other. But we've got it done so far. I keep arguing, if we keep focusing on solving problems, finding solutions, that we can keep getting it done.
That's great. How about you, Representative Abbott? What are you going to tell freshmen that are coming in? How do you coach people?
Yeah, I think in our caucus we offer a mentorship program that I think has worked for some people. They wanted to try that, and that's been useful. But I mean, I think the Capitol's a professional place. Lou's right that things get emotional and they get intense, and I think I try to prepare people for that, because it can catch you by surprise sometimes. Tell the truth, listen. When people have something to say to you, you can learn, and don't bring legislation to wound, like Lou said, bring legislation that delivers for your community. It's pretty simple advice, but I think it's what you need up there. The pace of it and the intensity of it, and sometimes the emotional nature of it, to slow down, to listen, to make sure you're telling the truth. You're doing what you said you were going to do, and to think about the way that legislation or your words impact other people, different lived experiences. I think, that's good advice. And I think it served our caucus pretty well in some tough times, and, Lou's caucus too. I agree. Like the people that I've met, that are going to be new are a talented group of like committed people with a diverse array of experience. And I'm excited to get to know both the Democrats and the Republicans better this session.
Great. So we know that, in my opinion, both of you have great track records in being very approachable, being open-minded. You both bring your own values and your own priorities that really come from your communities, but you have demonstrated, in my opinion, the kind of some of those Mike Mansfield-esque civility qualities. And so, but we know that there's bigger things in play. Like you try and vote your conscience, but sometimes there's also the caucus is there, and the caucus is saying, you got to be with us on this vote. We need you. Maybe there's even going to be consequences if you're not with us on something. And so I want to talk about the caucus's role overall in civility, because I think we've seen, especially in DC over the last 12, 14 years, when major legislation passes, oftentimes it's just on a party line vote. It squeaks by. And so it's like, what is the caucus's role when it comes to a civil environment? And so I want to start with you, Representative Jones. The Republicans could have super majorities in the legislature. It looks almost guaranteed at this point. There's no question that they're going to be in the majority. What is the majority's role in fostering a civil environment?
Again, I break stuff down into terms that make sense to me. I'm fairly visual. I always say, tell folks that the majority votes their priorities, but we have to respect the right that the minority has. They speak, right? The minority's tool is they have to be able to speak. So the majority votes, the minority talks and influences outcomes because they don't have the ability to make significant votes. I believe the majority must not behave like a bully. It has to defend the minority's right to speak, to participate, and to be at the table. They were elected, just as we were, by the same number of people in the same number of seats, right? So I do believe you have to focus on that, and to not do so does a disservice to the state, right? You have to ensure that everyone's at the table, even if you're in the majority. And I've had the opportunity to not be in the majority. It's never a great experience, but it's better if you can be treated respectfully and let your ideas be heard. I also have another thing I will say, which is you should vote your conscience. I will not do unconscionable things for anyone. And then I argue that I'm elected to represent a group of constituents. I come from a rural area primarily. It's small, it's rural. I probably won't always see eye to eye with Republicans from an urban area. I've come from a small school. Billings is the largest school. Small hospital, large hospitals. So I owe a duty to those that sent me there. It's a representative republic. I need to put their interests first. And to the possibility, right, we are part of a caucus, a team. So I'll vote with the caucus when I can, but not if it is against a conscience or my constituents. And then the other part is just, most time you just don't have all the answers. Listen to everyone. And you'll think, wow, I hadn't thought of that. I always tell people, you want to change my mind, bring a more compelling argument, present better facts. You just say you're wrong, I'll say, well, thank you for your opinion. But present some better facts, present some better details, and we can work on this thing. for the most part, there's a group that will always look and listen and work on trying to solve the details and want to make a difference. Some folks like making a lot of statements as well.
So Representative Abbott, kind of a different angle, and that's the minority's role in civility. And I think a lot of folks would be surprised to look at vote counts of like even the last legislature where, you know, of course, in the House, there were 67 Republicans, 33 Democrats, Republican governor. And so it's just, you know, every vote 67-33. And it's like, no, I mean, there's a lot of interesting votes and things like that. And despite being in a minority, there are ways to be effective and get priorities done, or at least stop the other priorities of the other party. But I just want to give you an opportunity, because when you have fewer, it's kind of like, well, what is your role at that point in time in creating a civil environment in the political arena?
Yeah, so I thought about this question a lot. And Lou's right that every one of the 33 of us represented 10,000 people, right? And we went there to deliver for our communities. And so our voice is important, you know, and the minority's role a lot of times is to hold the party in power accountable for policies they pass and the way that they govern. And so we really went into that session with that in mind. I think in terms of civility, you know, I think our role and our leadership team really approached the leadership team on the Republican side to try to take care of problems before they started, to try to keep things that started in committee or that we knew would be intense from bleeding out onto the floor. And, you know, I think sometimes we were successful and sometimes we weren't. There were a few times, and we will remember them, that debates got a little out of control, or, you know, decorum was broken. I think, you know, we also, the minority leadership's role, I think, there is to manage those situations, to make sure that we're holding people accountable to decorum, which really allows for the minority's voice to be heard. Decorum is incredibly important, and the rules of procedure are incredibly important to make sure that, you know, we get to, you know, express our ideas and make sure that we're representing our constituents. I do think there were a couple times where legislation, you know, really undercut a community's basic humanity or undercut tribal sovereignty. And those are times that I think it is very difficult to be civil. And I wonder what the rule for civility is there. You know, it's a challenge, I think, for us. And there's being polite, and there's, you know, dealing with, you know, some of the bills that were there, anti-trans, really went after trans kids, things like that, you know, that was very hurtful to our caucus. And I think we really struggled with how to engage in those moments, and how to be respectful to decorum in the process, but also acknowledging how hard those moments were for people, you know, in my community. I'm a gay person, and, you know, our families, those were hard days, you know. And I think Frank Garner, who's retired, God bless, was always somebody that came and, you know, reached out and made sure I was okay, and made sure, you know, that our caucus felt okay and respected. And those were sometimes hard conversations, but I really appreciated, you know, he's a Republican from the Flathead. I really appreciated the way that he was really supportive and caring in those moments. And I think those are the relationships that we can really value and learn from. And that kind of attitude and those kind of moments is something that I know I really appreciate. I know other members of my caucus did too.
Thanks for sharing. Nobody's perfect. And so, I'm sure Mike Mansfield would have been the first to admit that about himself, although we know he was a very humble person. There are probably instances where he felt like he fell short of his own standards, whether it came to civility or whatever. And so I don't know whether either of you would be willing to share any kind of experience where you felt like, boy, that wasn't my best moment, and here's kind of how I dealt with that, or just a situation in the legislature that was just really dicey, and it was hard to come back from after a debate, after a big vote, but then here you go, you've got 20 more bills that you need to vote on, or a budget you need to pass. And so I'll just kind of throw that out there for either of you to tackle if you want to.
And whatever order you want, Kim. Yeah,
Oh, I just finished talking for like 10 minutes.
all right. So, yeah, we do fall short, right? Where people are human, you fall short quite often. I remember a number of times, it gets long, you get emotional, in particular, you start carrying and working on pieces of legislation. And if you're a detail intense person, you take it personal, you work really hard at it. You try to build something that's saleable, and if someone executes it haphazardly or gets real what perceived to be disrespectful, you can get quite angry about it. I remember one time, as I've said, I've worked on the budget side most of my time, whether it's finance and claims or approps. And I think this time I was probably the chair of finance and claims. I remember we had Saturday morning meetings working on what we always do, which is the numbers, trying to get the numbers to balance. And we'd been working late, and I had meetings with the budget director in the morning and 2 or 3 or 4 other people. And I was tired and half owly and came in and somebody said about 2 things. And I said, to hell with this, I'm done with it. I'm standing where I'm standing. I'm done with you, and walked out. And took me about a half hour to cool off. And then I thought, boy, that was foolish on your part, wasn't it? That's really, you would have scolded somebody for behaving that way. So I did ultimately go back and apologize and say, look, it wasn't my best moments, but we can work on this. Maybe it's time sometimes you got to put it away for a little while. But yeah, and there's been some scenarios last year on the floor of the House that again, I'm chair of a probe, so I don't always get the control of the floor, but I intervene if things get too far out of hand at times that I felt were inappropriate, that people were being disrespected. You're not going to stop that. People are emotional trumps logic many times, but you do need to hold yourself accountable. And if you don't get it right, back up, take a deep breath, say, hey, I screwed that up. Let's try that again and keep on rolling. I mean, it's an intense period of time, and there may be folks that have more time off than I do, but I tend to arrive early and work late, and it tends to be a lot of days and a lot of weekends. And by the end, you're a little tired, and sometimes your patience gets a little thin.
Representative Abbott, how about you?
Yeah, I can definitely think of a couple times in committee where I lost my patience on questions, and asked maybe someone that was testifying in committee a question that wasn't fair. And I think you kind of, or at least the times that I can think of, I almost immediately knew it, and you're tired, you are losing your patience. It gets hard there, the pace of it. But in those situations, what I did is exactly what Lou just said. Like, I walked right out in the hallway and apologized. And I think a sincere apology is a really important thing to learn how to do, and it can be hard. But that's the lesson I learned, unfortunately, a few times, is that when you make a mistake, acknowledge it. When you get feedback that something landed in a way that you didn't intend, take that feedback seriously and apologize. I've had to apologize to lobbyists and to members of both caucuses, I think, over the time I've been there, and I meant it, and they were accepted, and I appreciated that.
Thanks for sharing. So one question that came in both ahead of time, but also has been asked in the questions here on the chat, is the seating arrangements. And I've heard that dangled out there. And of course, a lot of folks know that Republicans sit on one side of the chamber, Democrats on the other. And if there's more of one, then they might bleed over into one of the other sides. But it's pretty much arranged from a partisan standpoint. I believe that at the state constitutional convention, which people weren't elected as Democrats, Republicans, whatever, but I think we all kind of know which way people leaned as individuals. they just sat amongst each other. There was nothing like that we see in the legislature. So as just kind of a fun idea, is that practical? Would that ever happen in a million years? And then the last part of the question would just be, is there anything else in the rules process or in the legislative process that you think could be changed from a rules standpoint, from a procedure standpoint, to facilitate more civility in the legislative process? And if you're okay with it, let's start with you, Representative Abbott.
Oh yeah. So I think maybe Dave Verne from up in Whitefish brought up could we stagger people? Could we sit next to, Democrat, Republican? I think I don't know if that's feasible. I think that, like Lou was saying earlier, like we are operating like a team, we do need to communicate with each other, and that makes it a little bit harder. But I think that the evenly divided interim committees are a really good exercise in, having to work together to get anything that moves has to be bipartisan. I think a lot of that work, if there are ways to expand that and give people opportunities, I think that's something that we could do. And it's not everybody supports evenly divided interim committees, but I think it's been like a really good exercise. And having always been in the minority, and when I was engaging at the Capitol before I served, I was mostly working on issues that were minority issues. And I think, it was the one opportunity that Democrats got to chair a committee and learn that skill. There's all sorts of value in it. And, if there are opportunities to expand that kind of thing, I think it would be a good thing to pursue.
So for our audience, Representative Abbott was talking about interim committees, which there's a variety. There's more than a dozen that meet in the off season, and they're evenly split between Democrats, Republicans, and House and Senate, actually. And it's been that way since interim committees were basically created out of subcommittees from the Legislative Council in the 70s and 80s. So actually there's been talk about doing away with that kind of a makeup where it should be more reflective of the legislature. You wouldn't have those kind of splits, the even splits. So Representative Jones, whether it's the alphabetical seating, whether it's change in rules or process to facilitate civility, what kind of ideas do you think are feasible and ones that are just no deal?
I would be surprised if you could redo the seating on the floor. The caucuses do behave in some manner like a team, right? You do your conscience, your constituents, but at some point you ran as one party or the other, and it does that might be it would be difficult for me to envision a scenario where that would be accomplished. I do always support the rules being fair, right? So you can move stuff to the correct committees. I've resisted since I've got there any sort of dictatorial rules that allow stuff to be assigned to committees that it doesn't belong in. If it's a judiciary bill, it should go to judiciary. If it's a business and labor bill, it should go to business and labor. I've resisted, there's efforts been made to say, well, the chairman of the committee can decide what bill's been heard. Well, I don't remember they were elected king. And so I believe everyone has a voice. I don't have to vote for your bill, but you do have a right to present it and let it exist in the light of day. And so the more of those things we do, we ensure that everybody gets the right to present their bill. They get to have it presented in a manner where the committee hearing is fair, right? It's not shortened or it's not messed with, that we just allow all the voices to be heard. The interim committees are been neutral for a long time. It's becoming the challenge. It has became that as the minorities gotten smaller, we've got to the point where we're not able to assign Republicans to interim committees because there's not enough space, and the Democrats now are sitting on two. And so there's some discussions of, do you split them? There's administrative committees and just interims. You have to do some work there to ensure that duly elected legislators do get to serve on them. I do find them informative processes. I wouldn't want them to become just bill mills and promote the DC chaos we hear about all the time, the hyperpartisanship. But again, the fairer you can play, one, you might be shocked. You might actually learn something that's important and find out that other people have good ideas too. You know, that's just play fair and listen. And the rules need to promote that, right? The rules need to promote that the system is fair. And if that happens, it's not a beautiful system. It's still pretty emotional, but it works itself out.
So we had an interesting question come up in the content or the chat section. One of the questions that's popped up is just, do you think that the press overemphasizes the differences of the parties? You know, kind of what I was saying earlier about, it's not like every vote last session was 67-33, but if, you know, you read articles, of course, there's going to be articles that talk about the more sensational, bigger things, more politically charged things. And so, you know, how much goes in that's just super boring, routine things, 100-0, and you know, is that overemphasized in the press, the differences? How about you, Representative Jones?
It seems like a lot of the time, we can't paint the press with all one too. And when you talk about the votes of last session, if you take a look at, for example, the Montana Free Press, I look at their site sometimes, and they track the numbers, and they'll show you that the vast majority of votes in the Montana Legislature, bills normally pass with a substantial bipartisan majority. Most bills aren't that controversial. People have some agreement, and they never make news. You just never hear about them. It's but the things that sells papers and makes headlines are the times where there's either a disagreement within the parties or across the parties, and that makes headlines. And it seems like human nature likes the headlines more, right? So so people write about it, and because it's an emotional topic, there's somebody for the press to interview. They're willing to talk about it. I've had a really good relationship with the press. You know, I try to make a point in approps and finance. We hold a meeting once a week and we talk about exactly what's going on in approps, what we're seeing, what we're doing. And it's just an informative deal. Sometimes they write stuff up, sometimes they don't. You know, I make a point of if people are informed in what's happening, then you don't have to worry about the rumors getting you. You know, the facts might get you, but at least they're blaming you with rumors. But yeah, I would hope the press emphasizes at times that at least in Montana, we do work together a lot and we listen to each other a lot, right? And people's individual skill sets are considered. You know, I began serving with Representative Cafaro 20 years ago now, I guess. And we haven't agreed on every issue, but we're good friends. Right. And I certainly respect her knowledge in health and human services. And sometimes when I have questions there, she'll tell you, I'll call her and say, Mary, what is this and what's going on? You know, the fact she's a D doesn't subtract from her expertise there and my respect for it. And so I think we got to work on that, right? It's just individuals. Just because someone's not on the same side of the aisle doesn't mean that they don't have good ideas or that their input isn't valuable.
So Representative Abbott, how about you? I mean, I guess the question from the audience person is, are we kind of getting a warped view just from news accounts about what it's really like? Is it really all that contentious? Could there be more focus on bigger bills that have more bipartisan support? Or what's your perspective on how the press does when it comes to reporting what goes on in the Montana Legislature?
I think both. I think that fights tend to be more interesting, and where there's big division, and I mean just interesting to the public, than the sort of nuance of like a budget subcommittee all agreeing on something, and moving it forward. So I don't blame the press for gravitating towards divisive issues that are emotional and getting a lot of attention. And I think we saw a bunch of those last session. I have a lot of respect for the Capitol Press Corps, like Lou. I do just press time with the Capitol News Corps, once a week, once every couple weeks, just to make sure that, they can ask questions about what's going on. They know what's important to us, what's coming up. And it does help you stay in front of rumors or misunderstandings. And I think it's like a pretty talented press corps for the size of this state. And I really like working with them. And I think they do a good job. And, yeah, there's a lot, and you can look at the Free Press. There's a lot that we agree on. And, I think that those don't make very interesting news stories a lot of the time, is the truth of it. So I think both things are true. I think there is a bit of a warped sort of outward communication, but it's also reflective of what's happening too. You know what I mean? Like these bills are happening, these fights on the floor are happening, the divisiveness is there. So the press is telling the truth. It's just, some things I think are more interesting to readers than other things.
Thank you for sharing. Probably the last question that I'll ask and give you guys a chance to answer it, and then have any kind of closing comments that you want. There was an incredible amount of attention in the audience questions that were submitted ahead of time about the Constitution, the state Constitution. And I think that's fueled by two different things. Number one is the 50th anniversary of that. And there were a lot of different events, forums on it, and people talking about how it came together and why language came together the way it did. And then it was kind of this electoral process of like, if one of the parties gets a supermajority in the legislature, the ability to put things on the ballot as a constitutional amendment that could significantly alter those kinds of things, So it looks now like Republicans could have that supermajority. And so I just want to give you both an opportunity to talk about that. What do you think that really looks like? Are we going to see a call for a constitutional convention? Are we going to see 100 amendments? Are we going to, are there going to be enough differences even within the supermajority party that very little of that will even make it to the ballot? Any kind of thoughts that you have, Representative Abbott?
I think Montanans really like their Constitution. And I think we saw that in the vote yesterday, in the Supreme Court races. I think, Montanans by and large, they picked the incumbents. And I think that they picked them largely because they appreciate the way the Constitution's been interpreted and their rights and our liberties. And we have expansive rights and liberties in the Montana Constitution. It's unique. Those are incredibly important to Montana voters. Whether or not constitutional amendments make it to the ballot is really about Lou's side of the aisle. I think, I could see a lot being brought. I don't know how many will make it. And I'd be interested in what Lou thinks about it. I think that there are a lot of people that have a lot of ideas about changing some of our rights, and some of our liberties, but I don't know that they get, even if Republicans, have the supermajority, and you're right that they will. I don't know that they get that kind of support on changing the Constitution. We'll see. I don't know, Lou, what do you think?
I would tend to agree with that. If I look at if we just look at the majority, on the majority side at this moment, the majority is very independent thinking. It's not going to always agree with itself on a ton of issues. It's often divided on issues, depending on urban, rural, depending on where you came from and your perspective and what's important to you. So one, just by having a supermajority doesn't mean you're going to get a supermajority vote on all issues. So one, I would say that, and when I look at this supermajority, and in particular, look at your seniors that may be done, so they're not worried about running for re-election. I'm not sure. There's going to be a certainly issues they're not going to be willing to put on the ballot. And then there's also the question of just like LR 131, if you choose to put something on the ballot, it says nothing about the people supporting it. You know, you better take a look out there and see what has support. I think there's things that the people might support. An example just off the top of my head is probably I saw a poll come in on a picture ID. That it looks like a significant group of the percentage of Montanans might be supportive of picture IDs. But if you just randomly pick stuff out of a hat and assume you're going to make major changes, whether it's to privacy or to a ton of other items, and just especially sweeping change, one, I'm not sure it passes the legislature. And two, even if it does pass the legislature, I'm not sure it's going to do much other than lose. I always tell folks, if you want to put something on the ballot, you better tell me the $2 million you have to promote it, because otherwise it's probably going down.
All right, so closing comments, and one thing maybe to consider in your closing comments, just we have a lot of people watching tonight that are not in public office. Anything that they can do, advice either for them to engage in civil dialogue, to start these kinds of conversations in their communities, any kind of advice like that you would give to people who are outside of public office, or any other kind of closing comments that you have for us tonight, and maybe keep it to 1 minute. How about Representative Jones?
Well, I always tell folks the world is very much influenced or controlled by those who attend and engage. Just showing up isn't enough. You got to show up and put yourself out there and engage. If you want to make a difference, show up and engage. And by engage, it means not only speak, but listen and understand that people wear different lenses, that perspectives matter. And that if you want to be successful, it's about relationships, listening, and helping understand other people's perspectives. And so with that, these are great programs. I think all of these type discussions help drive civility and help people recognize the importance of civility.
Thank you. Representative Abbott.
Yeah, I think that trying to start where there's agreement and build from there is always a good approach when you're engaging with someone that you have fundamental disagreements with. And it can be hard, it takes practice. And there's only one way to practice, and that's just doing it, and I think as things have gotten increasingly polarized, we've all had to practice that a little bit more than we used to. But that would be my advice, is to, there's a lot that we agree on. And if you can start there, you can hold the conversation open. But yeah, I really appreciate you putting this together, John, and appreciate the center for having us. And, Lou, I'll see you next week.
Next week
Excitement begins.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much. We owe you a debt of gratitude for joining us tonight. We know you're very busy. You're about to get a lot busier. I want to thank the audience for joining us tonight and their interest in this topic. The amount of interest we had was tremendous. And so we want to keep things like this going. And the way we keep it going is that the center is funded in part by generous donations from folks. If you want to figure out a way to help the center keep these kinds of dialogues going, feel free to contact us because we would appreciate your support. And the other thing is, feel free to suggest future dialogues. These are the kinds of conversations, the events that we want to hold. Sometimes we do in person, sometimes we do Zoom. And also feel free to give comments about this dialogue as well, and things that we can improve for the future. So with that, we thank everyone for joining us tonight on this chilly night. And please look out for more Mansfield Center events in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes.